When we learn something new, we don't simply record information in isolation. The brain weaves together not just the content itself, but also the circumstances surrounding the moment of learning. The room you're sitting in, the mood you're carrying, the faint hum of background noise, even the internal state of your body, all of these elements become part of the memory trace. This principle is known as encoding specificity, and it reveals something fundamental about how memory works. What we encode is never just the fact or skill, but the entire context in which it was embedded. Encoding specificity was first articulated by cognitive psychologist Endel Tulving in the 1970s. Tulving proposed that memory is not like writing on a blank page, where information is stored cleanly and retrieved identically. Instead, memory is cue-dependent. The effectiveness of retrieval depends on the overlap between the conditions present during learning and the conditions present during recall. If the cues match, retrieval becomes easier. If they don't, even well-learned information can feel unreachable. This was demonstrated in a now classic experiment involving divers. Researchers had participants learn lists of words either on land or underwater. Later, they were tested in both environments. The results were striking. People who learned underwater recalled more words when tested underwater, and those who learned on land performed better on land. The environmental context had become part of the memory itself. The brain had encoded not just the words, but the sensory surround, the pressure of the water, the muted quality of sound, the visual field of the underwater world. The same principle applies to internal states. If you learn something while feeling anxious, that emotional state becomes a retrieval cue. If you learn while caffeinated, calm, or fatigued, those physiological signatures are encoded alongside the information. This is why students sometimes struggle during exams even though they studied thoroughly. The calm of their bedroom differs sharply from the tension of the exam hall. The mismatch in context disrupts retrieval. But encoding specificity is not merely a quirk of memory. It reflects something deeper about how the brain organizes information. Memory is not a storage system. It is a network of associations. Every piece of information is embedded in a web of connections, links to other facts, to sensory impressions, to emotions, to the time and place it was encountered. When we try to remember, we are essentially reactivating a portion of that network. The more cues we have that match the original encoding, the more likely we are to light up the right pathways. This has direct implications for how we study. If you want to maximize retention, you can intentionally vary the context in which you learn. Study in different rooms, at different times of day, in different postures. This approach, called varied context encoding, prevents memory from becoming overly tied to a single environment. It makes the information more flexible, more generalizable. You are training the brain to access the material from multiple entry points. There is also a flip side. If you know you'll need to retrieve information in a specific setting, say during a presentation or a particular type of exam, it can help to study in conditions that resemble that setting. Match the lighting, the seating, even the time of day if possible. Some athletes visualize the competition venue during training for this reason. They are priming the same neural pathways they will need to activate under pressure. Interestingly, context reinstatement can also happen mentally. If you're struggling to recall something, you can deliberately reconstruct the context in which you learned it. Picture the room, remember what you were feeling, recall what you were thinking about before and after. This mental reinstatement acts as a scaffold, helping the brain navigate back to the target memory. Law enforcement agencies use a technique called the cognitive interview, which guides witnesses to mentally return to the scene of an event. This technique reliably improves recall, even for details that seemed forgotten. Encoding specificity also explains why certain smells or songs can trigger vivid memories. The olfactory system has direct connections to the hippocampus and amygdala, brain regions central to memory and emotion. A particular scent encountered during learning can become a powerful retrieval cue later. The same goes for music. If you study while listening to a specific playlist, that music can help unlock the associated material. This is not magic. It is the brain following the associative paths it built during encoding. Understanding context-dependent memory changes how we think about forgetting. Often, we assume we've lost information when in fact it's simply difficult to access. The memory is still there, but we lack the right cues to retrieve it. This is why recognition is easier than recall. In a multiple-choice test, the correct answer is presented to you. It serves as a powerful retrieval cue. In a free recall situation, you must generate the cue yourself, which is harder. The information hasn't vanished. The pathways to it are less clearly marked. One of the most practical applications of encoding specificity involves how we organize study sessions. Rather than studying the same material in the same place at the same time in the same way, it's more effective to introduce variability. Study vocabulary in the morning at your desk, then review it in the evening on a walk. Work through math problems in silence, then try a few while instrumental music plays in the background. This distributed contextual encoding makes the knowledge less brittle, less dependent on a narrow set of conditions. It also suggests that real-world learning that happens across different settings and situations, is often more robust than learning confined to a single environment. A child who learns to read in multiple contexts, with different people, in varied emotional states, builds a more resilient literacy than one who only practices in a single tutoring room. The knowledge becomes woven into a broader experiential fabric. The brain does this naturally to some extent. When you recall a memory, you don't retrieve a static file. You reconstruct it, pulling together fragments from different neural regions, visual details from the occipital lobe, sounds from the temporal lobe, emotions from the amygdala. Each time you recall, you are also re-encoding, often blending in new contextual details from the present moment. This is why memories are malleable, why they change subtly each time we revisit them. Context isn't just part of the original encoding, it becomes part of every subsequent retrieval. For learners, this means that studying is not just about repetition. It's about building a rich, multi-dimensional network of cues. The more angles from which you approach a concept, the more retrieval routes you create. You are not just learning facts. You are constructing an architecture of access. And in that architecture, context is not noise. It is signal. It is part of the structure that holds knowledge in place and makes it reachable when you need it. Imagine two students preparing for an exam. The first reads through her notes carefully, highlighting key passages, reviewing the material multiple times until it feels familiar. The second closes her notebook after one read-through and spends the remaining time writing out everything she can remember, checking her answers, and trying again. Intuitively, the first approach seems more thorough. But research consistently shows that the second student will remember more and remember it longer. The difference lies in a phenomenon called the testing effect, and it reveals something counterintuitive about how memory works. Retrieval is not simply a readout of stored information. Retrieval is itself a learning event. The testing effect refers to the finding that actively recalling information produces better long-term retention than additional study of the same material. This has been demonstrated across hundreds of experiments involving diverse types of content, vocabulary words, historical facts, scientific concepts, medical procedures, even motor skills. The effect is robust and large. In some studies, a single retrieval practice session produces memory benefits equivalent to multiple restudy sessions. And the advantage grows over time. After a delay of days or weeks, the gap between those who practiced retrieval and those who only restudied becomes even more pronounced. At first glance, this seems puzzling. If the goal is to get information into memory, why would pulling it out be more effective than putting it in again? The answer lies in what happens during the act of retrieval. When you try to recall something, you are not passively accessing a stored file. You are actively reconstructing the memory from fragments distributed across different neural networks. This reconstruction process requires effort, and that effort changes the memory itself. Each successful retrieval strengthens the neural pathways associated with that memory, making it easier to access in the future. Neuroscientists have identified specific mechanisms that support this strengthening. Retrieval activates the hippocampus, the brain region essential for forming and consolidating new memories. But it also engages the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive control and effortful processing. This combination of hippocampal and prefrontal activity seems to trigger processes that stabilize the memory trace. One such process is reconsolidation, the idea that each time a memory is retrieved, it becomes temporarily unstable and must be restored. During this window of instability, the memory can be modified or strengthened. Retrieval practice essentially forces the brain to reconsolidate the information in a more durable form. There is also evidence that retrieval practice enhances the connectivity between the memory and other related knowledge. When you recall something, you are not just activating the memory itself, but also the surrounding network of associations. This creates additional retrieval routes, multiple pathways leading to the same information. It is similar to hiking a trail repeatedly. The more you walk it, the clearer and more accessible it becomes. But if you also create side paths and connections to other trails, you have even more ways to reach your destination. The benefits of retrieval extend beyond strengthening individual memories. Retrieval practice also improves what researchers call transfer, the ability to apply knowledge in new contexts. When you retrieve information, you are practicing the process of accessing it under conditions that may differ from the original learning context. This makes the knowledge more flexible, less tied to the specific cues present during initial encoding. You are training the brain to find the information even when the surrounding context has changed. One of the most compelling aspects of the testing effect is that it works even when retrieval is difficult or incomplete. In fact, some research suggests that the harder you have to work to retrieve something, the greater the learning benefit, provided you eventually succeed or receive feedback. This is because effortful retrieval activates more extensive neural processing. The brain has to search more broadly, engage more cognitive resources, and build stronger connections. Easy, fluent retrieval feels productive, but it may not be changing the memory as much. Difficulty, within limits, is a sign that learning is happening. This has practical implications for how we structure study sessions. Instead of reviewing material until it feels smooth and automatic, it is more effective to test yourself as soon as possible, even if you struggle. Flashcards are popular for a reason. They force retrieval. But the key is not just using flashcards, it is using them in a way that requires genuine effort. If you can recall an answer instantly, the card is not providing much benefit at that moment. The learning happens when you have to pause, search your memory, work to reconstruct the answer. Retrieval practice also helps learners identify what they actually know versus what merely feels familiar. This is a critical distinction. When you reread notes, the material often feels recognizable. You see it and think, yes, I know this. But recognition is a weak test of memory. Recall is much more demanding. It exposes gaps in your understanding that rereading can mask. When you attempt to retrieve and fail, you gain accurate feedback about the state of your knowledge. You learn what you don't yet know, which allows you to focus your efforts more strategically. Interestingly, the benefits of retrieval practice are not limited to straightforward factual recall. They extend to conceptual understanding as well. When you practice retrieving explanations, principles, or procedures, you are strengthening your grasp of the underlying structure, not just memorizing surface details. For example, in one study, students who practiced retrieving the causes and mechanisms behind scientific phenomena showed better understanding on later tests than students who restudied the same material. The act of generating the explanation forced them to organize and integrate their knowledge in ways that passive review did not. There are different forms of retrieval practice, each with its own characteristics. Free recall, writing down everything you can remember about a topic without cues, is among the most challenging and also the most beneficial. Short answer questions require you to generate specific information. Multiple choice questions are easier because they provide cues, but they still require you to evaluate and select the correct answer, which is more active than simply rereading. Even elaborative techniques, like explaining a concept in your own words or teaching it to someone else, involve retrieval. You must pull the information from memory and organize it coherently, which strengthens retention. Timing matters as well. Immediate retrieval practice, right after learning, provides some benefit, but delayed retrieval, waiting a few hours or even a day, produces stronger long-term retention. This is because delayed retrieval is harder. You've begun to forget, so retrieving requires more effort and more extensive neural reactivation. The challenge is that delayed retrieval feels less effective in the moment. It is harder, more frustrating, less fluent. But that subjective difficulty is misleading. Struggle is precisely what drives deeper learning. Feedback plays an important role too. When retrieval fails or produces an error, feedback corrects the mistake and helps the brain encode the right information. But feedback is most effective when it comes shortly after the retrieval attempt, while the memory is still active and malleable. This is one reason why self-testing with answer keys works well. You retrieve, check your answer, and immediately correct any errors. The cycle of retrieval, feedback, and re-encoding creates a powerful learning loop. The testing effect challenges deeply ingrained study habits. Many learners equate studying with input, reading, listening, watching. But the research suggests that output, retrieving, generating, reconstructing, is often more powerful. The act of bringing information to mind, of making it active again, is what transforms fragile, newly formed memories into stable, accessible knowledge. Retrieval is not the endpoint of learning. It is the mechanism through which learning happens. Each time you pull information from memory, you are not just demonstrating what you know. You are changing what you know, making it stronger, more connected, more likely to be there when you need it. Memory does not stand still. From the moment something is learned, it begins to fade. This is not a flaw in the system, but a feature, a way for the brain to prioritize information that is relevant and discard what is not. The German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus was the first to map this process systematically. In the 1880s, he conducted meticulous experiments on himself, memorizing lists of nonsense syllables and testing his recall at various intervals. What he discovered was a predictable pattern. Memory decays rapidly at first, then levels off. Within hours, much is lost. Within days, more slips away. But the rate of forgetting slows over time, leaving a residue of memory that can persist for years. This pattern is now known as the forgetting curve, and understanding it is central to designing effective study strategies. The forgetting curve reveals something important. Most forgetting happens soon after learning. If you study something tonight, you might retain 70% tomorrow, 50% in a few days, and 30% in a week. But if you do nothing, the curve continues its downward slope. The knowledge becomes inaccessible, not because it was erased, but because the neural pathways leading to it have weakened. The memory is still there, latent, but retrieving it requires more effort than the brain is willing to invest without a strong cue. This is where spaced repetition enters. The idea is deceptively simple. Review material at increasing intervals over time. Instead of cramming all your study into one session, you spread it out. Review tomorrow, then 3 days later, then a week later, then 2 weeks later. Each time you revisit the material, you are catching it just as it is beginning to fade. You retrieve it, which strengthens the memory, and the rate of forgetting slows. The interval before the next review can then be extended. Over time, the material becomes more and more resistant to forgetting. The effectiveness of spaced repetition has been demonstrated in countless studies across different types of learners and different kinds of content. The effect is so reliable that it is considered one of the most robust findings in cognitive psychology. In head-to-head comparisons, spaced practice consistently outperforms massed practice, studying the same total amount but concentrated in a short period. The benefit is not small. Spaced repetition can double or even triple long-term retention compared to cramming. Why does spacing work so well? One explanation is that each retrieval practice session, spaced over time, forces the brain to work harder. When you review something immediately after learning it, the memory is still fresh and retrieval is easy. But when you wait, the memory has begun to fade. Retrieving it now requires more effort, more reconstruction, more engagement of neural resources. This effortful retrieval strengthens the memory more than easy, fluent recall. The spacing introduces what researchers call desirable difficulty, a challenge that feels harder in the moment but produces better learning in the long run. Another explanation involves the way memories are consolidated. Consolidation is the process by which newly formed, fragile memories are stabilized and integrated into long-term storage. This process takes time. It involves the gradual strengthening of synaptic connections and the reorganization of neural networks. Spacing gives the brain time to consolidate between study sessions. Each review then builds on a more stable foundation, reinforcing the memory at a deeper level. There is also evidence that spacing enhances what is called contextual variability. When you study the same material on different days, in different settings, in slightly different mental states, you are encoding it in multiple contexts. This creates more retrieval cues and makes the memory less dependent on any single context. The knowledge becomes more robust, more flexible, more likely to be accessible when you need it in a new or unexpected situation. The optimal spacing interval depends on how long you want to remember the information. If you need to retain something for a few days, short intervals work well. Review after a few hours, then the next day. If you want to remember something for months or years, the intervals should expand accordingly. Review after a day, then a week, then a month, then several months. The general principle is that the spacing should be long enough to introduce difficulty, but not so long that retrieval fails completely. If you wait too long and cannot recall the information at all, the benefit is reduced. The sweet spot is when retrieval is challenging, but still possible. This principle has been formalized in algorithms used by spaced repetition software. Programs like Anki or SuperMemo track which items you know well and which you struggle with, then schedule reviews accordingly. Items you recall easily are shown less frequently. Items you find difficult are reviewed more often. The system adapts to your individual forgetting curve, maximizing efficiency. You spend your time on what needs reinforcement, not on what is already solidly encoded. But spaced repetition is not just for rote memorization. It works for conceptual understanding as well. When you revisit a complex idea multiple times over weeks or months, each encounter allows you to see it from a new angle, to integrate it more deeply with other knowledge, to notice nuances you missed before. The spacing gives your understanding time to mature. Ideas that seemed abstract on first encounter become clearer, more intuitive, more connected to what you already know. One reason many learners resist spaced repetition is that it feels inefficient in the short term. When you review something you studied yesterday, you remember most of it. It feels like you are not learning much. Cramming, by contrast, feels productive. You are taking in large amounts of information quickly, and your performance on an immediate test can be quite good. But this is an illusion. Cramming produces temporary gains that fade rapidly. Spaced repetition produces slower, steadier gains that last. The subjective experience of learning is often a poor guide to actual learning. Fluency, the ease with which information comes to mind, feels like mastery, but it can be misleading. When you mass your practice, the material becomes very fluent very quickly, and you interpret this fluency as evidence of strong learning. But fluency can be transient. It reflects short-term accessibility, not long-term retention. Spacing, on the other hand, introduces forgetting, which makes retrieval harder and less fluent. This feels like you are not learning as well, but in fact, the opposite is true. The difficulty is a sign that deeper encoding is taking place. This mismatch between subjective experience and objective learning is one reason why spaced repetition is underutilized. Students often cram because it feels effective and because it fits the demands of academic schedules. Exams are typically clustered, and there is pressure to learn a large amount of material quickly. But if the goal is retention beyond the exam, spacing is essential. Information crammed the night before may be accessible the next day, but much of it will be gone within weeks. Information reviewed at expanding intervals will remain accessible for months or years. There is also a psychological component to spacing. Each time you successfully retrieve something you thought you had forgotten, you gain confidence. You prove to yourself that the memory is still there, that the effort to encode it was not wasted. This builds a sense of mastery that is more realistic and more durable than the false confidence that comes from cramming. You learn to trust that knowledge, once properly encoded, does not simply vanish. It may fade, but it can be rekindled with practice. Spacing also distributes cognitive load over time, which reduces fatigue and improves focus. Marathon study sessions are mentally exhausting. Attention wanes, processing becomes shallow, and the later material is encoded weakly, if at all. Shorter, spaced sessions allow you to study when you are fresh, when your attention is sharp, when your brain is capable of deep encoding. The total time invested may be the same, but the quality of that time is much higher. In practical terms, implementing spaced repetition requires planning. You cannot review tomorrow unless you schedule it today. You need a system, a calendar, a spaced repetition app, a simple notebook where you track what needs review and when. The system does not need to be complex, but it does need to be consistent. The power of spacing comes not from a single review session, but from the cumulative effect of many sessions distributed over time. The forgetting curve is not an enemy. It is a map. It shows you when memory is most vulnerable, and therefore when intervention is most valuable. Spaced repetition is the practice of intervening at precisely those moments, catching the memory before it fades beyond retrieval, strengthening it, and extending the interval until the next intervention. With each cycle, the memory becomes more durable. The curve flattens. What once required frequent review now requires only occasional reinforcement. The knowledge becomes part of you, accessible not because you studied it recently, but because you studied it well. When you practice the same skill or study the same type of problem repeatedly in a single session, performance tends to improve quickly. You develop a rhythm, a pattern of response that becomes smooth and automatic. This feels productive. But there is a hidden cost. When you later encounter that same skill or problem type mixed in with others, performance often drops. The smooth, automatic response you developed was fragile, tuned narrowly to the repetitive practice environment. This is the limitation of blocked practice, grouping similar items together. The alternative is interleaving, and it works differently. Instead of practicing one thing until it feels easy, you mix different types of problems or concepts within a single session. You might work on one math problem, then switch to a different type, then another, cycling through them unpredictably. This approach feels harder and less productive in the moment, but it produces something blocked practice does not: discrimination learning. Discrimination learning is the ability to recognize which strategy, concept, or approach applies to a given problem. It is not enough to know how to solve a particular type of equation if you cannot identify that it is the right equation to use. In real-world situations, problems do not come labeled by type. You must figure out what kind of problem you are facing before you can apply the appropriate solution. Interleaving trains this skill directly. When you practice in blocks, the problem type is always the same within a given session. You do not need to identify what you are looking at. You already know. Your attention can focus entirely on execution. But this means you are not practicing the step that often matters most, the step of categorization, of matching the problem to the appropriate mental model. When the test comes and problems are mixed, you may know the procedures, but struggle to select the right one. Interleaving forces you to make that selection every time, which strengthens your ability to distinguish between problem types. Research on interleaving has shown consistent benefits, particularly in domains that involve categorization or procedural selection. Mathematics is a classic example. Students who practice different types of problems in an interleaved fashion learn to recognize problem structures more reliably than those who practice in blocks. They make fewer errors when problems are presented in a mixed format, as they typically are on exams or in applied contexts. The same principle holds in other domains. Art students who study different painting styles in an interleaved sequence learn to identify those styles more accurately than students who study each style in isolation. Athletes who practice different types of shots or movements in a mixed order show better performance in competition, where they must adapt fluidly to changing demands. The key mechanism behind interleaving is that it requires constant cognitive adjustment. Each time you switch from one type of problem to another, you must retrieve a different set of rules, a different approach, a different schema. This repeated switching forces the brain to actively compare and contrast the different problem types. You begin to notice what distinguishes them, what cues signal that one approach rather than another is appropriate. These distinctions become part of what you encode. You are not just learning procedures, you are learning when each procedure applies. Blocked practice, by contrast, allows you to execute the same procedure repeatedly without this comparative processing. You develop fluency, but you do not develop the ability to discriminate. The distinctions between problem types remain implicit and unexamined. When you later encounter a mixed set of problems, you lack the experience of deciding which approach to use. The fluency you built does not transfer. Interleaving also combats a phenomenon known as the illusion of competence. When you practice in blocks, improvement is rapid and visible. You start off slow, then get faster and more accurate within the session. This feels like learning. But much of that improvement is specific to the immediate context. It reflects short-term adaptation rather than durable knowledge. When you return to the same problem type days later, performance may have regressed. Interleaving, by contrast, slows down improvement within a session. You do not develop the same smooth rhythm. But the learning that does occur is more robust, more likely to persist over time and transfer to new contexts. The difficulty of interleaving is, once again, desirable. It makes practice sessions feel less successful. You make more errors, you proceed more slowly, you feel less confident. But this subjective experience is misleading. The errors you make during interleaved practice are informative. They reveal confusions that blocked practice would mask. When you misidentify a problem type and apply the wrong procedure, you receive immediate feedback about what you do not yet understand. This feedback helps you refine your ability to discriminate, to notice the features that distinguish one problem from another. There is neural evidence supporting the benefits of interleaving as well. Studies using brain imaging show that interleaved practice activates regions associated with cognitive control and executive function to a greater extent than blocked practice. These are the regions involved in task switching, inhibition, and selection among competing responses. Interleaving recruits these systems, strengthening your ability to manage cognitive flexibility. Blocked practice, by minimizing the need for such control, provides less opportunity to develop it. Interleaving is not appropriate for all stages of learning. When you are first encountering a new concept or skill, some amount of focused, blocked practice can be helpful. You need to understand the basic procedure, develop initial fluency, build a foundation. But once the basics are in place, interleaving becomes more effective. It prevents overlearning of any single procedure and promotes the integration of multiple procedures into a flexible, adaptive repertoire. The principle of interleaving extends beyond procedural skills. It applies to concept learning as well. When studying related concepts, say, different types of economic systems, or different categories of biological classification, interleaving the examples helps you build sharper category boundaries. You learn what features are essential to each category and what features are merely incidental. You develop a more nuanced understanding of the conceptual landscape. Consider learning to identify bird species. If you study pictures of robins, then pictures of sparrows, then pictures of finches, each in a separate block, you may learn to recognize each species in isolation. But you may not learn what distinguishes them from one another. When you later see a bird in the wild, where species are not conveniently grouped, you may struggle. Interleaving. The species, robin, sparrow, finch, robin, finch, sparrow, forces you to attend to the distinguishing features from the start. You learn not just what a robin looks like, but how a robin differs from a sparrow. What cues reliably predict one species versus another. This comparative processing is central to expertise. Experts in any domain have developed rich, differentiated category structures. They can quickly and accurately identify problem types, recognize patterns, and select appropriate strategies. Interleaving is a way to build this discriminative expertise from the beginning, rather than hoping it will develop on its own through unstructured experience. One practical challenge with interleaving is that it requires more planning. Blocked practice is easy to implement. You work through one section of a textbook, then move to the next. Interleaving requires you to deliberately mix problems from different sections, to create a practice sequence that cuts across categories. This takes effort, but the payoff is substantial. Many textbooks and curricula are structured around blocked practice, which means learners must often create their own interleaved practice sets. Interleaving also interacts well with other evidence-based strategies. When combined with spaced repetition, for instance, you can interleave problem types across multiple spaced sessions, gaining the benefits of both spacing and discrimination learning. When combined with retrieval practice, you can test yourself on interleaved sets of problems, forcing both retrieval and categorization. These strategies are not mutually exclusive. They are complementary, each targeting a different aspect of the learning process. The discomfort of interleaving is something to expect and even welcome. It means the brain is working harder, making more adjustments, building more flexible representations. Blocked practice feels smooth because it is repetitive and predictable. Interleaving feels rough because it is varied and demanding. But smoothness is not the goal. The goal is durable, transferable learning, the kind that holds up under novel conditions, that adapts to unexpected challenges, that allows you to recognize what you are looking at and respond appropriately. Interleaving builds that kind of learning. It trains the mind not just to execute, but to discern. And in most real-world applications, discernment is what separates competence from expertise. There is a form of learning that happens not through passive absorption, but through active questioning. When you encounter new information, you can simply accept it, noting the fact or procedure and moving on. Or you can pause and ask why it is true, how it works, what makes it different from something else you know. This second approach is called elaborative interrogation, and it represents a fundamentally different way of engaging with material. Instead of treating information as isolated units to be stored, you treat each piece as part of a larger structure that needs to be understood, connected, and integrated with what you already know. Elaborative interrogation involves generating explanations. When you learn that a particular species lives in a certain habitat, you ask why that habitat suits the species. When you learn that a historical event occurred, you ask what caused it, what the consequences were, how it relates to other events. When you learn a formula or procedure, you ask why it works, what principles underlie it, when it applies, and when it does not. These questions force you to go beyond surface-level encoding. They require you to activate prior knowledge, draw connections, and construct a coherent mental model. The benefits of elaborative interrogation have been documented across a wide range of learning contexts. Students who generate explanations for facts they are learning show better retention than those who simply read the facts repeatedly. The effect is particularly strong when the learner already has some relevant background knowledge. This is because elaboration works by linking new information to existing knowledge structures. The richer your prior knowledge, the more connections you can draw, and the more robust the resulting memory. This connects to a broader principle in cognitive science. Memory is associative. Information is not stored in isolation, but as part of a network. The more connections a piece of information has to other nodes in the network, the more paths there are leading to it, and the easier it is to retrieve. Elaboration actively builds these connections. When you explain why something is true, you are linking it to causal principles, to related concepts, to examples, to contrasts with other ideas. Each link strengthens the overall structure. Self-explanation is a closely related technique. It involves explaining concepts or procedures to yourself as you learn them. You might read a passage in a textbook and then stop to articulate in your own words what the passage means, how it fits with what you have already read, what questions it raises. Or you might work through a problem step by step, explaining to yourself why each step is necessary and what principle it reflects. Self-explanation transforms learning from a receptive process to a generative one. You are not just receiving information, you are actively constructing understanding. Research on self-explanation shows that it is one of the most effective learning strategies available. Students who engage in self-explanation consistently outperform those who do not, even when total study time is held constant. The effect is seen across disciplines: physics, biology, mathematics, reading comprehension. Self-explanation helps learners notice gaps in their understanding, identify misconceptions, and build more coherent mental models. One reason self-explanation is so powerful is that it forces you to confront what you do not understand. When you try to explain something and cannot, you receive immediate feedback. You realize that your grasp is incomplete, that you need to revisit the material or seek additional information. This kind of self-monitoring is critical for effective learning. Without it, you may continue under the illusion that you understand, only to discover during a test or application that you do not. Self-explanation also promotes deeper processing. When you simply read or listen, you can process information at a shallow level, focusing on individual words or surface features without fully integrating the meaning. But when you explain, you must process the information deeply enough to articulate it coherently. You must identify the key ideas, understand how they relate, and express them in a way that makes sense. This deep processing leads to stronger, more durable memories. The act of generating explanations also makes learning more active and engaging. It keeps your mind from wandering. When you are passively reading, it is easy to let your eyes move over the words while your mind drifts elsewhere. But when you are explaining, you must stay engaged. You cannot explain what you have not understood. This sustained engagement improves both comprehension and retention. Elaborative interrogation and self-explanation are particularly effective for conceptual learning, understanding principles, mechanisms, and relationships rather than memorizing isolated facts. When you are learning a concept, asking why and how questions helps you grasp the underlying logic. You move beyond rote memorization to genuine comprehension. This kind of understanding is more flexible and more transferable. You can apply it to new situations, recognize when it is relevant, and adapt it to novel problems. There is also evidence that elaboration helps with later recall by creating distinctive, meaningful memory traces. When you simply repeat a fact to yourself, the memory trace is relatively shallow and generic. But when you elaborate, when you link the fact to a reason, a cause, an example, the memory becomes richer and more distinctive. It stands out more clearly against the background of other memories, making it easier to locate and retrieve later. The process of elaboration does not require elaborate techniques or extensive time. Even brief moments of questioning can make a difference. After reading a paragraph, you might pause for 10 seconds and ask yourself what the main point was and how it connects to the previous paragraph. After learning a new term, you might ask why it matters or how it differs from a related term. These small acts of elaboration accumulate over a study session, producing significant gains in understanding and retention. One challenge with elaboration is that it requires knowledge to build on. If you are encountering a topic for the first time with no relevant background, it can be difficult to generate meaningful explanations. In such cases, it may be more effective to first acquire some basic information through reading or instruction, then engage in elaboration once you have a foundation to work from. Elaboration is not a replacement for initial encoding. It is a way to deepen and strengthen that encoding. Another challenge is that elaboration can sometimes lead you astray if your explanations are based on misconceptions. If you generate an incorrect explanation and do not receive corrective feedback, you may encode and reinforce the error. This is why elaboration works best in conjunction with feedback, whether from a teacher, a textbook, a peer, or even from testing yourself and checking your answers. The cycle of generating an explanation, receiving feedback, and refining your understanding is more powerful than elaboration alone. Interestingly, elaboration does not just help you remember what you have learned. It can also help you understand it more deeply in the first place. The act of explaining forces you to organize your thoughts, clarify vague ideas, and identify what you do not yet understand. It turns learning into an active problem-solving process. You are not just absorbing information, you are making sense of it, integrating it, questioning it. This sense-making is central to what education should be. Learning is not about accumulating facts. It is about building coherent, connected, usable knowledge structures. Elaborative interrogation and self-explanation are tools for building those structures. They encourage you to ask questions, to seek understanding, to treat new information not as something to be memorized, but as something to be comprehended and integrated. In practice, incorporating elaboration into your study routine can be straightforward. After each section of reading, pause and summarize the key points in your own words. Ask yourself why the information is important, how it connects to what you already know, and what questions it raises. When working through problems, explain each step to yourself or to an imaginary listener. When reviewing notes, do not just reread them. Turn them into explanations, as if you were teaching the material to someone else. Teaching, in fact, is one of the most powerful forms of elaboration. When you prepare to teach something, you must organize the material clearly, anticipate questions, and explain it in a way that makes sense. This process forces deep engagement with the content. It is why the saying, "The best way to learn is to teach," has persisted. Teaching is elaboration taken to its fullest form. Elaborative interrogation and self-explanation transform studying from a passive to an active endeavor. They shift the focus from coverage to understanding, from repetition to integration. They make learning harder in the moment, but more meaningful and more durable in the long run. And they cultivate a habit of mind that extends beyond any single study session, a habit of asking why, of seeking connections, of refusing to accept information without understanding it. This habit is the foundation of lifelong learning. The human brain processes information through multiple channels. When you read a text description of a concept, you are engaging the verbal system, language-based processing that unfolds sequentially, word by word, sentence by sentence. But when you look at a diagram, a chart, or an image, you are engaging the visual spatial system, a parallel processing network that handles shapes, spatial relationships, colors, and configurations. These two systems operate somewhat independently, each with its own pathways and mechanisms. And when both are engaged simultaneously, something powerful happens. The information is encoded twice, through two different modalities, creating what researchers call dual coding. Dual coding theory, developed by psychologist Alan Pivio in the 1970s, proposes that memory is enhanced when information is represented both verbally and visually. The reason is straightforward. If you encode something only verbally, you have one pathway to retrieval. If you encode it both verbally and visually, you have two. If one pathway is blocked or weakened, the other may still provide access. The two representations are redundant, but that redundancy is valuable. It makes memory more robust, more resistant to forgetting, and more likely to be accessible under varied conditions. The verbal system excels at processing language, words, grammar, syntax, abstract concepts. It handles information that is discrete and sequential. When you read a definition, follow an argument, or memorize a list, you are using verbal processing. This system is tied to language areas in the left hemisphere of the brain, particularly regions like Broca's area and Wernicke's area. It is powerful for encoding conceptual and propositional knowledge, statements about the world that can be articulated in words. The visual spatial system, by contrast, excels at processing images, spatial layouts, and concrete objects. It handles information that is holistic and parallel. When you picture a scene, visualize a diagram, or imagine the arrangement of objects in space, you are using visual spatial processing. This system involves regions in the occipital lobe, responsible for visual perception, and the parietal lobe, responsible for spatial reasoning. It is powerful for encoding perceptual and imagistic knowledge, representations that are hard to fully capture in words, but easy to grasp in pictures. The two systems can work together. When you learn the water cycle, for instance, you might read a verbal description: evaporation, condensation, precipitation, collection. But you might also look at a diagram showing water rising from the ocean, forming clouds, falling as rain, and flowing back to the ocean. The verbal description provides the conceptual framework, the labels, the causal sequence. The diagram provides the spatial layout, the visual relationships, the gestalt. Together, they create a richer, more complete mental model than either alone. Research consistently shows that combining words and images improves learning. Students who study text alongside relevant illustrations perform better on tests than those who study text alone. The effect is particularly strong when the visuals are well designed, when they clarify relationships, highlight key features, or illustrate processes that are difficult to describe verbally. Poorly designed visuals, or visuals that are merely decorative, provide little benefit. The key is that the visual representation must add information or clarify structure in a way that complements the verbal content. One reason dual coding works is that it reduces cognitive load on any single system. Working memory, the mental workspace where active processing occurs, has limited capacity. If you try to hold too much information in the verbal channel, it becomes overloaded. But if you distribute the information across both verbal and visual channels, each system carries part of the load. You can process more information simultaneously without exceeding the limits of either channel. Another reason is that visual and verbal representations often emphasize different aspects of the same information. A verbal description of a cell might list its components: nucleus, mitochondria, ribosomes. A diagram shows where those components are located relative to each other, their shapes, their sizes. The diagram makes spatial relationships explicit, while the verbal description makes functional relationships explicit. Each representation highlights what the other leaves implicit. Together, they provide a more complete understanding. Dual coding is not limited to externally provided images. You can generate your own visual representations, even without drawing. Mental imagery, visualizing something in your mind's eye, engages the visual spatial system in much the same way as looking at an actual picture. When you read about a historical event and imagine the scene, you are creating a visual representation that complements the verbal one. When you learn a procedure and picture yourself performing it, you are encoding it both verbally and visually. The effectiveness of mental imagery has been demonstrated in many contexts. Athletes use visualization techniques to improve performance. They mentally rehearse a movement or a play, activating the same neural pathways involved in actual execution. Students can use similar techniques. When learning anatomy, you can visualize the structures in 3 dimensions, rotating them in your mind, examining them from different angles. When learning a mathematical concept, you can picture a graph, a geometric shape, or a number line. These self-generated images supplement verbal explanations and deepen understanding. There are individual differences in the ability to generate vivid mental images. Some people report clear, detailed visualizations, while others report vague or minimal imagery. But even those who do not experience vivid imagery can benefit from dual coding. The key is engaging both verbal and visual spatial processing, whether through external images, simple sketches, or even abstract spatial representations. For example, when learning hierarchical relationships, you might draw a tree diagram. The act of arranging information spatially, deciding what goes above, below, or beside something else, engages spatial reasoning, even if the diagram is not pictorially detailed. Dual coding also enhances the distinctiveness of memory traces. When you encode something only verbally, many concepts may have similar verbal representations. They are all just words, sentences, definitions. But when you add a visual component, each concept acquires a unique perceptual signature. The visual representation differentiates it from other verbally similar concepts. This distinctiveness makes retrieval easier. You have more cues to work with, and those cues are less likely to be confused with cues for other memories. One practical application of dual coding is creating visual aids while studying. You might sketch a diagram, create a flowchart, draw a concept map, or use color coding to organize information spatially. The act of creating these visual representations forces you to think about relationships and structure, which deepens processing. And the finished product serves as a visual memory cue. When you later try to recall the information, you can retrieve the image, which in turn helps you retrieve the associated verbal content. Another application is seeking out or creating multimedia learning materials. Educational videos, animations, and interactive simulations often combine verbal explanations with visual demonstrations. When well-designed, these materials leverage dual coding effectively. The narration provides verbal encoding, while the visuals provide spatial and imagistic encoding. The two work together to build understanding. However, not all combinations of words and images are beneficial. If the verbal and visual information are redundant, saying exactly the same thing in 2 modalities, there is little added value. If they are contradictory or poorly coordinated, they can interfere with each other, creating confusion rather than clarity. The most effective dual coding occurs when the 2 modalities are complementary, each contributing something the other does not. There is also a phenomenon called the split attention effect. If verbal and visual information are presented simultaneously, but in separate locations, for example, a diagram on one page and the explanation on another, learners must split their attention between the two. This increases cognitive load and reduces the benefit of dual coding. The solution is integrated presentation, placing labels directly on a diagram, providing captions near images, or using animations where the narration is synchronized with the visuals. Dual coding extends beyond static images. Gestures, physical movements, and spatial arrangements can also engage the visual spatial system. When you learn a concept by physically manipulating objects, moving through space, or using hand gestures to represent relationships, you are creating embodied spatial representations that complement verbal understanding. This is why hands-on learning is often so effective. It engages multiple systems simultaneously. The brain's architecture reflects the value of multiple coding systems. Evolution has equipped us with specialized mechanisms for processing language and specialized mechanisms for processing visual and spatial information. Dual coding takes advantage of this architecture. It does not force everything through a single bottleneck. It distributes the work across systems that operate in parallel, each contributing its strengths. For learners, the practical message is clear. Do not rely on words alone or images alone. Seek out or create representations that combine both. When studying, ask yourself not only what something means in words, but also what it looks like, where things are in relation to each other, how processes unfold in space and time. Draw diagrams, visualize scenes, use spatial metaphors, create mental images. The effort to represent information in multiple ways is not wasted. It is building multiple retrieval routes, reducing dependence on any single pathway, and creating a richer, more interconnected knowledge structure that will be there when you need it. The human brain processes information through multiple channels. When you read a text description of a concept, you are engaging the verbal system, language-based processing that unfolds sequentially, word by word, sentence by sentence. But when you look at a diagram, a chart, or an image, you are engaging the visual spatial system, a parallel processing network that handles shapes, spatial relationships, colors, and configurations. These two systems operate somewhat independently, each with its own pathways and mechanisms, and when both are engaged simultaneously, something powerful happens. The information is encoded twice, through two different modalities, creating what researchers call dual coding. Dual coding theory, developed by psychologist Alan Pivio in the 1970s, proposes that memory is enhanced when information is represented both verbally and visually. The reason is straightforward. If you encode something only verbally, you have one pathway to retrieval. If you encode it both verbally and visually, you have two. If one pathway is blocked or weakened, the other may still provide access. The two representations are redundant, but that redundancy is valuable. It makes memory more robust, more resistant to forgetting, and more likely to be accessible under varied conditions. The verbal system excels at processing language, words, grammar, syntax, abstract concepts. It handles information that is discrete and sequential. When you read a definition, follow an argument, or memorize a list, you are using verbal processing. This system is tied to language areas in the left hemisphere of the brain, particularly regions like Broca's area and Wernicke's area. It is powerful for encoding conceptual and propositional knowledge, statements about the world that can be articulated in words. The visual spatial system, by contrast, excels at processing images, spatial layouts, and concrete objects. It handles information that is holistic and parallel. When you picture a scene, visualize a diagram, or imagine the arrangement of objects in space, you are using visual spatial processing. This system involves regions in the occipital lobe, responsible for visual perception, and parietal lobe, responsible for spatial reasoning. It is powerful for encoding perceptual and imagistic knowledge, representations that are hard to fully capture in words but easy to grasp in pictures. The two systems can work together. When you learn the water cycle, for instance, you might read a verbal description: evaporation, condensation, precipitation, collection. But you might also look at a diagram showing water rising from the ocean, forming clouds, falling as rain, and flowing back to the ocean. The verbal description provides the conceptual framework, the labels, the causal sequence. The diagram provides the spatial layout, the visual relationships, the gestalt. Together, they create a richer, more complete mental model than either alone. Research consistently shows that combining words and images improves learning. Students who study text alongside relevant illustrations perform better on tests than those who study text alone. The effect is particularly strong when the visuals are well designed, when they clarify relationships, highlight key features, or illustrate processes that are difficult to describe verbally. Poorly designed visuals, or visuals that are merely decorative, provide little benefit. The key is that the visual representation must add information or clarify structure in a way that complements the verbal content. One reason dual coding works is that it reduces cognitive load on any single system. Working memory, the mental workspace where active processing occurs, has limited capacity. If you try to hold too much information in the verbal channel, it becomes overloaded. But if you distribute the information across both verbal and visual channels, each system carries part of the load. You can process more information simultaneously without exceeding the limits of either channel. Another reason is that visual and verbal representations often emphasize different aspects of the same information. A verbal description of a cell might list its components: nucleus, mitochondria, ribosomes. A diagram shows where those components are located relative to each other, their shapes, their sizes. The diagram makes spatial relationships explicit, while the verbal description makes functional relationships explicit. Each representation highlights what the other leaves implicit. Together, they provide a more complete understanding. Dual coding is not limited to externally provided images. You can generate your own visual representations even without drawing. Mental imagery, visualizing something in your mind's eye, engages the visual spatial system in much the same way as looking at an actual picture. When you read about a historical event and imagine the scene, you are creating a visual representation that complements the verbal one. When you learn a procedure and picture yourself performing it, you are encoding it both verbally and visually. The effectiveness of mental imagery has been demonstrated in many contexts. Athletes use visualization techniques to improve performance. They mentally rehearse a movement or a play, activating the same neural pathways involved in actual execution. Students can use similar techniques. When learning anatomy, you can visualize the structures in 3 dimensions, rotating them in your mind, examining them from different angles. When learning a mathematical concept, you can picture a graph, a geometric shape, or a number line. These self-generated images supplement verbal explanations and deepen understanding. There are individual differences in the ability to generate vivid mental images. Some people report clear, detailed visualizations, while others report vague or minimal imagery. But even those who do not experience vivid imagery can benefit from dual coding. The key is engaging both verbal and visual spatial processing, whether through external images, simple sketches, or even abstract spatial representations. For example, when learning hierarchical relationships, you might draw a tree diagram. The act of arranging information spatially, deciding what goes above, below, or beside something else, engages spatial reasoning, even if the diagram is not pictorially detailed. Dual coding also enhances the distinctiveness of memory traces. When you encode something only verbally, many concepts may have similar verbal representations. They are all just words, sentences, definitions. But when you add a visual component, each concept acquires a unique perceptual signature. The visual representation differentiates it from other verbally similar concepts. This distinctiveness makes retrieval easier. You have more cues to work with, and those cues are less likely to be confused with cues for other memories. One practical application of dual coding is creating visual aids while studying. You might sketch a diagram, create a flowchart, draw a concept map, or use color coding to organize information spatially. The act of creating these visual representations forces you to think about relationships and structure, which deepens processing. And the finished product serves as a visual memory cue. When you later try to recall the information, you can retrieve the image, which in turn helps you retrieve the associated verbal content. Another application is seeking out or creating multimedia learning materials. Educational videos, animations, and interactive simulations often combine verbal explanations with visual demonstrations. When well designed, these materials leverage dual coding effectively. The narration provides verbal encoding, while the visuals provide spatial and imagistic encoding. The two work together to build understanding. However, not all combinations of words and images are beneficial. If the verbal and visual information are redundant, saying exactly the same thing in two modalities, there is little added value. If they are contradictory or poorly coordinated, they can interfere with each other, creating confusion rather than clarity. The most effective dual coding occurs when the two modalities are complementary, each contributing something the other does not. There is also a phenomenon called the split attention effect. If verbal and visual information are presented simultaneously, but in separate locations, for example, a diagram on one page and the explanation on another, learners must split their attention between the two. This increases cognitive load and reduces the benefit of dual coding. The solution is integrated presentation, placing labels directly on a diagram, providing captions near images, or using animations where the narration is synchronized with the visuals. Dual coding extends beyond static images. Gestures, physical movements, and spatial arrangements can also engage the visual spatial system. When you learn a concept by physically manipulating objects, moving through space, or using hand gestures to represent relationships, you are creating embodied spatial representations that complement verbal understanding. This is why hands-on learning is often so effective. It engages multiple systems simultaneously. The brain's architecture reflects the value of multiple coding systems. Evolution has equipped us with specialized mechanisms for processing language and specialized mechanisms for processing visual and spatial information. Dual coding takes advantage of this architecture. It does not force everything through a single bottleneck. It distributes the work across systems that operate in parallel, each contributing its strengths. For learners, the practical message is clear. Do not rely on words alone or images alone. Seek out or create representations that combine both. When studying, ask yourself not only what something means in words, but also what it looks like, where things are in relation to each other, how processes unfold in space and time. Draw diagrams, visualize scenes, use spatial metaphors, create mental images. The effort to represent information in multiple ways is not wasted. It is building multiple retrieval routes, reducing dependence on any single pathway, and creating a richer, more interconnected knowledge structure that will be there when you need it. There is a peculiar finding in memory research that runs counter to intuition. When learners generate information themselves, even imperfectly, they remember it better than when they passively receive the same information. If you are asked to complete a word fragment, say, elent, ent, you will remember the word elephant more reliably than if you simply read it. If you try to solve a problem before being shown the solution, you will understand the solution more deeply than if you watch someone solve it for you. This phenomenon is called the generation effect, and it speaks to a broader principle. The mind learns more from its own efforts, even unsuccessful ones, than from observation alone. The generation effect has been documented across many types of material and tasks, generating words from definitions, completing sentences with missing words, answering questions before reading the answers, solving problems before seeing worked examples. All of these produce better retention and understanding than passively studying the same content. The act of generating engages cognitive processes that passive reception does not. You must search memory for relevant information, retrieve partial knowledge, construct a response, evaluate it, and integrate feedback. Each of these steps contributes to learning. One reason generation is powerful is that it requires active retrieval. When you try to generate an answer, you must pull information from memory, even if that information is incomplete or uncertain. This retrieval attempt, as discussed earlier, strengthens the memory trace. But generation goes beyond retrieval. It also involves construction. You are not just accessing something already stored. You are assembling a response from fragments, making inferences, filling gaps. This constructive process creates new associations and deepens encoding. Generation also engages elaborative processing. When you generate, you must think about the meaning of what you are producing. You cannot generate mechanically. You must understand, at least to some degree, what you are trying to say or do. This forces semantic processing, thinking about meaning rather than surface features. And semantic processing, as research consistently shows, produces stronger, more durable memories than shallow processing. Another factor is attention. Passive study allows the mind to wander. You can read a page while thinking about something else entirely. But generation demands engagement. You cannot generate an answer while your mind is elsewhere. The task pulls you into the material, focuses your attention, and sustains it long enough for encoding to occur. This sustained attention is one reason generation produces better learning, even when the generated response is incorrect. This brings us to an important and sometimes unsettling idea. Errors during learning are not necessarily bad. In fact, generating errors can be beneficial, provided that feedback follows. When you attempt a problem and get it wrong, you activate relevant knowledge, identify gaps, and prime your mind to encode the correct information more deeply when it is revealed. The error makes you aware of what you do not know, which increases attention to the correct answer. The contrast between your incorrect response and the correct one highlights what was missing or mistaken in your thinking. This principle is sometimes called productive struggle or productive failure. The struggle to generate an answer, even when you fail, is productive because it prepares the mind for learning. It is not wasted effort. It is cognitive work that sets the stage for encoding. This stands in contrast to unproductive struggle. Floundering without direction, without feedback, without ever-reaching resolution. Productive struggle is followed by clarification. You try, you fail, you learn why you failed, and you encode the correct information in the context of your attempt. Research on productive failure shows that students who attempt to solve complex problems before receiving instruction often perform better on later tests than students who receive instruction first. This seems backward. Shouldn't you learn the material before trying to apply it? But the attempt, even when unsuccessful, activates prior knowledge, reveals gaps, and focuses attention on the key features of the problem. When instruction then follows, it is received in a prepared mind. A mind that has already grappled with the challenge and understands why the solution matters. The generation effect also interacts with motivation. Generating your own answers is more engaging than passively reading. It gives you a sense of agency, a feeling that you are actively participating in the learning process rather than simply receiving information. This engagement can increase intrinsic motivation, making studying feel less like a chore and more like a challenge to be met. And motivation, in turn, supports sustained effort and deeper processing. However, generation is not always beneficial. If the task is too difficult, if you have no relevant prior knowledge to draw on, generation attempts may produce random guesses that contribute little to learning. The key is that generation works best when you have some foundation to build on. some partial knowledge that can be activated and refined. If you are completely unfamiliar with a topic, initial instruction or reading may be necessary before generation becomes useful. There is also a balance to strike between generation and guidance. Pure discovery learning, leaving learners to figure everything out on their own, is often inefficient and can lead to persistent misconceptions. But some amount of generation, some opportunity to struggle productively, enhances learning. The optimal approach often involves a cycle: attempt, feedback, attempt again. You generate, receive correction or guidance, and then generate again with better information. This iterative process combines the benefits of generation with the clarity of direct instruction. One practical application is to test yourself before studying. Instead of reading a chapter and then testing yourself, reverse the order. Skim the headings, then try to answer questions about the content before reading. You will get many wrong, but those errors will focus your attention on what you do not know. When you then read, you will be more attuned to the answers, more likely to notice and encode them deeply. This pre-testing approach leverages the generation effect to make subsequent studying more effective. Another application is to attempt practice problems before reviewing worked examples. Many students look at a worked example first, thinking it will show them how to proceed. But this passive approach often leads to shallow understanding. A better strategy is to try the problem first, even if you are unsure. Struggle with it. Make an attempt. Then look at the worked example. The example will make more sense because you have already engaged with the problem. You will notice what you missed, understand why certain steps are necessary, and encode the solution in the context of your own thinking. The generation effect also suggests that creating your own study materials is valuable. Instead of using pre-made flashcards, make your own. Instead of highlighting passages in a textbook, summarize them in your own words. Instead of copying notes, transform them into questions and try to answer them. The act of creating these materials forces generation, which deepens encoding. The materials you generate are tailored to your own understanding and gaps, making them more effective than generic materials created by someone else. There is something almost paradoxical about the generation effect. It says that difficulty, specifically the difficulty of constructing a response rather than receiving one, is beneficial. It says that errors, when followed by correction, contribute to learning rather than hindering it. It says that the effort of trying, even when you fail, is not wasted, but essential. This runs counter to much intuition about learning, which often equates ease with effectiveness and views errors as setbacks. But the research is clear. Difficulty that arises from generation is desirable difficulty. It signals that the brain is working, constructing, connecting. It means encoding is happening at a deeper level. When learning feels too easy, when you simply absorb information without effort, it is often a sign that the information is not being deeply processed, not being integrated, not being encoded in a way that will last. The generation effect reminds us that learning is not something done to us. It is something we do. It is active, effortful, constructive. And the more we engage in that active construction, generating answers, solving problems, creating explanations, the more durable and flexible our knowledge becomes. The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be lit, and generation is the spark that ignites understanding. When you close your eyes at night, you might imagine that learning has stopped. The day's work is done, and the mind rests. But in truth, something extraordinary is happening. While you sleep, the brain is not idle. It is actively processing the information you encountered during the day, stabilizing fragile memories, integrating new knowledge with old, reorganizing neural networks, and even discovering patterns you did not consciously notice. Sleep is not a passive intermission in the learning process. It is an essential phase of learning itself, during which memories are transformed from temporary traces into lasting structures. The relationship between sleep and memory has been studied extensively over the past few decades, and the findings are striking. People who sleep after learning retain significantly more than those who stay awake for an equivalent period. This is not simply because waking activity interferes with memory. Sleep actively strengthens memory through processes that occur only during sleep. Deprive someone of sleep after learning, and retention suffers. Allow them to sleep, and retention improves. The brain uses sleep to consolidate what was learned while awake. Sleep is not a single uniform state. It consists of distinct stages, each with characteristic brain activity, and each contributing differently to memory consolidation. The two major categories are non-REM sleep and REM sleep. Non-REM sleep is further divided into stages, including light sleep and deep, slow-wave sleep. Each stage appears to serve specific functions in the consolidation process. Slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, is particularly important for consolidating declarative memories, facts, concepts, events, things you can consciously recall and describe. During slow-wave sleep, the brain exhibits large, synchronized waves of electrical activity. These slow oscillations coordinate activity across widespread brain regions, allowing the hippocampus and the neocortex to communicate. The hippocampus, which temporarily holds new memories, replays them to the neocortex, which integrates them into long-term storage. This replay happens repeatedly throughout the night, each iteration strengthening the memory trace and embedding it more deeply into the cortical network. Research using brain imaging and electrophysiology has captured this replay process. When rats learn to navigate a maze, specific patterns of neural activity fire in their hippocampus as they move through the maze. During subsequent slow-wave sleep, those same patterns fire again, but much faster, a kind of high-speed replay of the day's experience. This replay is not random. It is selective, focusing on information that was important, novel, or emotionally significant. The brain is curating, deciding what to consolidate and what to let fade. REM sleep, characterized by rapid eye movements, vivid dreams, and brain activity that resembles waking, plays a different role. REM sleep appears to be particularly important for consolidating procedural memories, skills, habits, motor sequences. It also supports emotional memory processing and the integration of new information into existing knowledge networks. During REM sleep, the brain forms new associations, connects disparate pieces of information, and engages in what might be called creative reorganization. Some evidence suggests that REM sleep supports insight and problem-solving, allowing the brain to discover solutions that were not apparent during waking thought. The emotional dimension of memory is also processed during sleep, particularly during REM. Emotional experiences are often remembered more vividly than neutral ones, and sleep enhances this effect. But sleep does more than strengthen emotional memories. It also appears to strip away some of the emotional intensity while preserving the factual content. This may be why sleep helps with emotional regulation. You go to bed upset, and you wake feeling calmer. The memory of what upset you remains, but its emotional charge has diminished. REM sleep, with its high levels of certain neurotransmitters and low levels of others, provides a neurochemical environment that allows this selective processing. The timing of sleep matters as well. Memory consolidation is most effective when sleep occurs soon after learning. Delaying sleep, staying up late, pulling an all-nighter, interferes with consolidation. The brain needs time to process what was learned, and if that processing is postponed or disrupted, the memories may never be fully stabilized. This is one reason why cramming the night before an exam is ineffective for long-term retention. Even if you perform reasonably well on the exam, much of the information will be lost within days because it was never properly consolidated. There is also evidence that sleep before learning is important. Sleep deprivation impairs the brain's ability to encode new information. The hippocampus, which is essential for forming new memories, functions poorly when you are sleep deprived. Attention wavers, encoding is shallow, and even if you manage to learn something, the memory is fragile and prone to rapid forgetting. Sleep prepares the brain for learning, clearing out the metabolic byproducts that accumulate during waking hours and resetting neural circuits to be receptive to new information. One fascinating finding is that sleep can enhance learning even without conscious awareness. In some studies, people are exposed to information while they sleep. Sounds, odors, or other cues associated with material they learned earlier. These cues, presented during sleep, reactivate the associated memories and strengthen them. This process, called targeted memory reactivation, shows that the sleeping brain is not closed off from the environment. It can respond to external cues and use them to guide consolidation. While this does not mean you can learn entirely new information while asleep, it does suggest that sleep is an active, responsive process that can be subtly influenced. The amount of sleep also matters. Partial sleep deprivation, getting 5 or 6 hours instead of 7 or 8, impairs consolidation, though perhaps not as severely as total deprivation. Chronic sleep restriction, common in modern life, gradually degrades memory function. The effects accumulate over time, leading to impaired learning, reduced cognitive performance, and increased forgetfulness. The brain needs sufficient time in each sleep stage to complete its consolidation work. Short sleep may provide some slow-wave sleep and some REM sleep, but not enough of either to fully process the day's learning. Naps can also support consolidation, particularly if they include slow-wave sleep. A nap of an hour or more can provide a consolidation boost, improving retention of material learned before the nap. Even shorter naps may help, though their benefits are more limited. The key is that the nap allows the brain to engage in some degree of memory replay and integration, even if not as extensively as a full night's sleep. Interestingly, the content of dreams may reflect the consolidation process. Dreams often incorporate fragments of recent experiences, weaving them into strange, surreal narratives. While the function of dreaming is still debated, some researchers propose that dreams are a byproduct of memory consolidation, the conscious experience of the brain sorting, connecting, and reorganizing information. Whether or not dreams themselves serve a function, they are a window into the active processing occurring during sleep. The practical implications of sleep-dependent consolidation are clear. If you want to learn effectively, you must sleep. Studying late into the night at the expense of sleep is counterproductive. The hours you spend awake may allow you to cover more material, but without sleep, much of that material will not be retained. A better strategy is to study earlier, then sleep. The sleep will do work that no amount of additional waking study can accomplish. If you have an exam or performance the next day, prioritizing sleep the night before is essential. But equally important is sleeping well in the nights after initial learning. The consolidation process unfolds over multiple sleep cycles. Material learned on Monday benefits not just from Monday night's sleep, but from Tuesday and Wednesday night's sleep as well. Consolidation is not instantaneous. It is a gradual process of stabilization and integration that continues over days. Sleep also interacts with other learning strategies. Spaced repetition benefits from sleep between practice sessions, as each sleep cycle provides an opportunity for consolidation. Retrieval practice followed by sleep produces stronger retention than retrieval practice followed by wakefulness. The combination of active learning strategies during the day and passive consolidation during the night creates a powerful cycle. Understanding sleep's role in learning changes how we think about rest. Sleep is not time away from learning. It is an integral part of the learning process, as important as the study itself. The brain uses sleep to finish what waking study begins, to stabilize, organize, integrate, and transform new information into knowledge that lasts. Without sleep, learning is incomplete. With it, the mind quietly, invisibly, builds the structures that will support memory, understanding, and skill for days, months, and years to come. The human mind is powerful, but it is also limited. At any given moment, you can hold only a small amount of information in conscious awareness. A phone number you just heard, the first few steps of a problem you are solving, the main point of a sentence you are reading. This capacity, known as working memory, is the mental workspace where active thinking occurs. It is where you manipulate information, make decisions, and construct understanding. But working memory is fragile and finite. Estimates vary, but most research suggests that adults can hold roughly 4 to 7 chunks of information simultaneously, and even that depends on the complexity of the material and the demands of the task. This constraint has profound implications for learning. If working memory becomes overloaded, if too much information is presented at once, or if the task requires juggling too many elements, processing breaks down, comprehension falters, encoding weakens, learning suffers. Recognizing and respecting the limits of working memory is central to effective study strategies and instructional design. This recognition forms the foundation of cognitive load theory, developed by psychologist John Sweller in the late 1980s. Cognitive load theory distinguishes between 3 types of mental effort. The first is intrinsic load, which arises from the inherent complexity of the material itself. Some concepts are simply more complex than others. Learning basic arithmetic involves lower intrinsic load than learning calculus. Understanding a single word requires less cognitive capacity than understanding a paragraph. Intrinsic load cannot be eliminated. It is a property of what you are trying to learn, but it can be managed by breaking complex material into smaller, more manageable pieces. The second type is extraneous load, which arises from the way information is presented. Poorly designed instruction can impose unnecessary cognitive demands that do not contribute to learning. If a diagram and its explanation are separated on different pages, you must hold information from one in working memory while searching for the other. If instructions are unclear, you waste cognitive resources trying to figure out what you are supposed to do. If irrelevant information is included, you expend effort processing material that does not serve the learning goal. Extraneous load is not inherent to the material. It is a product of design decisions, and it can and should be minimized. The third type is germane load, which is the productive cognitive effort directed toward building understanding, the mental work of integrating new information with prior knowledge, forming schemas, making connections, and organizing knowledge into coherent structures. Germane load is desirable. It is the kind of cognitive effort that leads to learning. The goal of effective instruction and effective studying is to reduce extraneous load, manage intrinsic load, and maximize germane load. You want to use your limited working memory capacity for the right kind of thinking. Schemas are central to this process. A schema is an organized knowledge structure, a mental framework that groups related information together. When you learn something new, you do not encode it as isolated facts. You integrate it into existing schemas, building connections and patterns. Over time, schemas become more elaborate and more efficient. An expert in a domain has rich, interconnected schemas that allow them to perceive patterns and relationships that a novice cannot see. What looks like a complex, overwhelming array of information to a beginner is seen by an expert as a familiar configuration, a single, meaningful chunk. Chunking is the process of grouping information into meaningful units. A string of random digits, 4, 9, 1, 7, 2, 0, 1, 9, is difficult to remember because each digit occupies a slot in working memory. But if you recognize that those digits form a date, April 9th, 1792, and that date is meaningful to you, you have compressed 8 pieces of information into one chunk. The chunk occupies a single slot in working memory, freeing up capacity for other information. Experts chunk information automatically. They see higher-order patterns that novices do not, which is why experts can handle much more complex material without overload. This has implications for how you study. When you are learning new material, your schemas are limited. The information feels overwhelming because you cannot yet chunk it efficiently. Each piece seems separate and demanding. As you build knowledge, schemas develop. Information that once felt fragmented begins to cohere. What required intense effort becomes more automatic. This progression from effortful, capacity-limited processing to automatic schema-driven processing is a hallmark of learning. One way to manage intrinsic load is to sequence learning appropriately. Start with foundational concepts before moving to complex applications. Build simple schemas before elaborating them. This does not mean avoiding difficulty. It means structuring difficulty so that working memory is not overwhelmed. If you try to learn everything at once, working memory cannot cope. If you build incrementally, each step consolidates into a schema that supports the next step. Reducing extraneous load requires attention to how material is presented and how you engage with it. When studying, eliminate distractions. Turn off notifications, close unrelated tabs. Create an environment where cognitive resources are not divided. When creating study materials, keep them clear and focused. Avoid cluttered diagrams, irrelevant details, or confusing layouts. Use spatial proximity to your advantage. Place labels directly on diagrams. Keep explanations close to examples. Integrate verbal and visual information so you do not have to split attention between them. Worked examples are an effective way to reduce cognitive load while promoting learning. A worked example shows the step-by-step solution to a problem, allowing you to study the solution process without the cognitive burden of generating it yourself. This frees up working memory to focus on understanding the rationale behind each step, the structure of the solution, and the principles being applied. Once you understand the worked example, you can then practice similar problems yourself, gradually reducing reliance on examples and increasing your own problem-solving capacity. However, worked examples are most effective when combined with practice problems. Studying worked examples alone can lead to an illusion of understanding. You follow the steps, they make sense, but you have not actually practiced generating solutions. The optimal approach is to alternate between studying worked examples and solving practice problems. This combination allows you to build schemas through examples while also engaging in the generative, effortful processing that strengthens memory. Another strategy is to use prompts and cues to guide cognitive processing. When reading complex material, stop periodically and ask yourself questions. What is the main idea? How does this relate to what I already know? What would I expect to come next? These prompts direct working memory toward productive processing. They prevent passive reading, where your eyes move over the words, but your mind is not actively constructing meaning. Cognitive load theory also explains why multitasking during learning is ineffective. When you try to study while also monitoring social media, listening to a conversation, or thinking about unrelated tasks, you are dividing working memory. Each task competes for limited capacity. Switching between tasks imposes additional load, as the brain must repeatedly reorient attention and reload relevant information into working memory. The result is shallow processing, weak encoding, and poor retention. Focused, undivided attention allows working memory to operate at full capacity, directed entirely toward the learning task. Interestingly, prior knowledge reduces cognitive load. When you already know something about a topic, new information can be integrated into existing schemas without overwhelming working memory. This is why learning in a domain becomes progressively easier as expertise develops. The first steps are the hardest because working memory is bearing the full load. As schemas build, they take over much of the cognitive work, leaving working memory free to handle novelty and complexity. This suggests that background reading, even if not deeply processed, can reduce cognitive load during later study. Exposure to vocabulary, concepts, and structures, even if you do not fully understand them, creates some initial schema. When you later study the material in depth, you have a framework to build on, which reduces the burden on working memory. This is one reason why preview reading before a lecture or skimming before detailed study can be beneficial. It primes the system, preparing working memory for the incoming information. Cognitive load theory also has implications for how you approach difficult material. If something feels overwhelming, it may be because intrinsic load is too high for your current level of schema development, or because extraneous load is interfering. The solution is not necessarily to work harder in the same way. It may be to break the material into smaller parts, to seek clearer explanations, to build prerequisite knowledge, or to eliminate distractions. Effective learning is not just about effort. It is about managing the cognitive system's limitations so that effort is applied productively. Working memory is the gateway to long-term memory. Information that never makes it through working memory because it was not attended to, because working memory was overloaded, because processing was too shallow, cannot be encoded. Respecting the limits of working memory is not about avoiding challenge. It is about structuring challenge in a way that allows the brain to process, integrate, and consolidate. It is about using your finite cognitive resources wisely, directing them toward the kind of thinking that builds understanding and creates knowledge that lasts.